Okay, so I come from a slightly different direction than most people in the room. I'm not either an artist or a roboticist. I'm actually, well, I suppose I'm a communication theorist, and that's a bit scary, isn't it? Because it sounds really boring, so I'm going to try not to be boring. My research is in communication studies. I analyse human-robot interactions as models of communication, but I'm analysing them from an arts humanities perspective. So I don't tend to do quantitative analyses, I just kind of look at things and interpret them and say things about them, okay? That usually makes scientists very unhappy with me, but other people sometimes like it. Okay. So this is about communication and otherness in robotic art, and I have a plan. I'm going to just briefly talk about how communication theory can be seen to operate within social robotics, within more standard types of social robotics. I'm going to look at how communication scholars actually critique the ideas that you see within social robotics, but for human communication. And I'm going to identify 3 key ideas in artistic practice that are useful if you want to rethink communication and if you want to rethink what it means to be social or to interact. And I'm going to look at some broader possibilities. I hope I'm going to have time. Okay, so if I first think about social robots, particularly the things that people think are social robots from the broader media that they're going to see. You see here, Asimo is a prime example. That's someone, so I'm staying with friends in Sydney. The first robot they mentioned to me is Asimo. So on some occasions, the goal for a social robot is to communicate accurate or helpful information directly to people. So Asimo has been, for example, positioned as a museum guide. But in general, Asimo uses spoken language supported by head, hand, and arm movements and whole body movements to communicate information to people in very, very human-like ways. Now, okay, I know that Asimo is broadly a scripted robot, so lots of the interactions with it are actually heavily scripted. But if you look at how humans are interpreting this robot, they're trying to interpret it almost exactly as a human. And that's how it's been designed. So understanding the communication of the robot in this way falls under something in communication theory called the cybernetic tradition, broadly, to do with the transmission or exchange of information. And that seems perfectly appropriate for a robot when you think about it, since it is a kind of cybernetic machine. The idea of clarity of expression in language, so the kind of voice that people will try to give to a robot, can then be linked with an idea of semiotic excellence, which is something which is a far more humanities idea. And you see that with Asimo as well. So the voice is very well modulated, and sort of it's designed to be clear. It's all about clearness, clarity, precision. Okay? A robot's communication may also be framed in light of a particular social situation. Now this here is quite an old example, I suppose. Kismet, the kind of archetypal expressive face, okay, which is what Cynthia Brazil really wanted to do, create an expressive face. Kismet's cute face here, pre-linguistic babbling speech, so not fully formed words, positioned the robot as an infant, and placed humans interacting with the robot in an infant-caregiver relation. And what that did was it caused them to exaggerate their tones of voice when interacting with the robot, making those tones of voice easier for the robot to pick up, and then produce its kind of slightly exaggerated, caricatured expressions back to the person. So the interaction is based around the kind of interaction you have with a small child that helps the robot to respond in expected ways and supports that frame even more. So it's like a circular relation that kind of builds on itself. So this is a sociocultural type of communication framing. It's framed around a particular occurrence, a particular type of context. There's a sort of psychological, a socio-psychological element to Kismet's communication as well, with the way that it craned its head and neck towards people when they came into the room if it was on, to try to draw them in. It needed to get them closer to it in order to interact better. So broadly, I've there discussed a number of theories of communication. Cybernetic, okay, so the idea of transmission of information. Semiotic, really to do with words and about how you put words together to make a clear, something that's clearly meaningful. Sociocultural, so the kind of framing within a social context, or even something narrower than that, such as an infant-caregiver relation. And socio-psychological, the idea of wanting to influence the other to come to you or to do what you want them to do. Now, those types of ideas about communication tend to feed into each other. They tend to sort of feed into the idea that you can understand a robot as human-like in a particular context. And while not talked about much in social robotics, that's for sure, the tendency to value what communicators have in common in this way, over and above their differences, and also to try to force them into a particular frame, a particular socio-cultural positioning, is understood as not a good thing by some communication scholars. Okay? So in particular, too, John Durham Peters and Amit Pinchevsky have critiqued communication theory that does this because it frames communication in terms of familiarity, in terms of commonality, in terms of sameness. And it results in what John Durham Peters calls the reduplication of the self. It's quite a philosophical context. Or Amit Pinchevsky's idea of the elimination of difference. The problem with this for a philosopher, therefore, is that it's a kind of violence against the other. You're trying to turn the other to the way that you think, or trying to fit them within your social frame, or trying to build them to look exactly like you in the tone of a humanoid robot. So analysing humanoid robots as reduplications of the self kind of makes sense. And while the effect of doing that may not be as important, say, as with a human-human interaction, where the otherness of the other, this is an ethical question that is discussed. There is an importance to not being violent to the other. Yeah. With a robot, maybe the concerns are different, but the creation of familiar robots, so the creation of human-like robots, designed to support this kind of easy, non-challenging communication, reduces the possibilities not only for humans to interact with a wide variety of other forms of machine, but it also reduces the new perceptual skills that you're likely to bring into those relationships. Because one of the things that some designers say is that in order to make the robot human-like, not only as a kind of an exterior thing, you actually need to try to perceive the world in the same way as a human in order to communicate with the human successfully. So you actually reduce the possibilities for that robot being different. Okay. So what I want to do now is look at the three things that I can identify from some examples in that. So the first thing I want to talk about is the encounter. These robots here are the autonomous light air vessels. They were created by Jed Burke and Nikhil Mitter, the ALAVs. Each ALAV is constructed from an electronic controller and a pair of small propellers which are mounted underneath. You can just about see them in the picture here, beneath a blimp-shaped helium-filled balloon. In version 1 of the installation, there were just 3 of these robots, and they interact together. So visitors entering the installation space, you can walk in and sort of be with them. Watch the robots explore. They move around their space. They're purportedly looking for food. All right? When they get separated, they call, and they make a whale-like noise, which is a microphone, a vibrator from a mobile phone against the helium balloon. So they sound a bit like whales. And when they come together, so they've been apart, they do a spinning dance. So they kind of look like they're happy when they find each other again. And humans watch this, and they also are able to draw the robots closer to them by holding the food source, which is this fiber optic lamp, okay? So they can interact with the robots more directly. So these robots are read as somewhat like animals. Okay, so there is a sense here, they're it's a bit like the visiting dolphins somewhere, and trying to draw them to you. But of course they're still very different, they're still very obviously machine-like. They're floating around in the air as well, so they're quite obviously something unusual. The ALAVs were designed to capture people's attention and to encourage further interaction, so to keep people in the room. One way to understand this kind of process is to invoke a philosophical conception of the encounter between self and other. Levinas is face-to-face. Okay? Now, it's important to realise that when Levinas talks about the face, he's not talking about the physical human face. So for Levinas, the whole body, a hand or curve of the shoulder can express as the face. Levinas thinks of communication as an adventure of subjectivity. It will involve uncertainty, and it certainly involves uncertainty when you're meeting something like the ALAVs. Levinas's theory is all about how communication is founded on the differences that exist between us, not upon commonalities. Limited communication happens with the ALAVs. I'm not going to say that people communicate with them over the long term, but they are interested in them, they want to stay with them, and they want to try to understand them. And what communication does happen here happens in the presence of overtly recognised otherness, There's a clear difference here. Okay. So if we move on to think about dance, and you've already seen these robots today, this is Fish and Bird, okay? So there's an element of dance within the A-labs when they dance together, when they spin around. Fish and Bird is kind of, for me, in my interpretation, based around a whole idea of dance, because they have choreographed movements and people watching them see them dance around with each other. And then as people enter the room, they actually interrupt that dance, and the robots turn to look at them, and they realize that they can begin to dance with the robots. Okay? Also, involved in that interruption and turning towards them is a clear sense of encounter as well. So there's a sense of the face-to-face here because of the facing motion of the chair. The second way that they communicate, of course, is through the fragments of text, which Mari has mentioned. So all these fragments of text that appear on the ground as well. So their communication also brings to mind something slightly more complicated in terms of ideas of how people and things may communicate. Irving Goffman's small behaviours. So Goffman talks about the glances, gestures, positionings, and verbal statements that people continually feed into the situation, whether intended or not. And communication with Fish and Bird is rather like that. What you're doing is you're watching their small movements and you're trying to work out how to elicit other movements from them, and they're also producing these fragments of text that fall on the floor and end up in quite a mishmash. It's not like a clear narrative, it's quite complicated. Communication between Fish and Bird and people is dynamic. People's sense of the robots emerges as they move around one another and as they read the written notes. They dance together, and it's a dance of dynamic communication. Interruption also plays a part. The robots are interrupted, as I've mentioned, but of course the people are also interrupted when they walk into the space and the robots turn their gaze to them, and it's quite disconcerting. They think that they're just wheelchairs dancing with each other, and it turns out that they know that you're there. And that's quite an important moment. Okay, so let's talk a bit more about interruption. Okay, so that was my slide that I should have moved on to, and I was too busy talking. So when talking about interruption, I like to talk about the example of OR here. OR was a robotic desk lamp, a robotic lighting assistant, which took part in a series of experiments with human participants, human and robot collaborating together to complete a task, and that robot was designed and built by Guy Hoffman, who's just sitting over there. I think that you'll be interested in this robot because, strictly, I suppose, it's not really from an art gallery. It's from MIT Media Lab. But this robot was built with acting theory in mind. So there was a concept of the Stanislavski technique, which was behind this robot, stressing the fact that the behaviour of actors needs to be coordinated. They must provide continuous reactions to each other, and that's kind of the idea that was behind this robot. So it's an idea, again, of dynamic flow, of this idea of dynamic communication, not turn-taking. And also, this robot acted in a play, which I'm sure you might be interested in. Okay, so in the experiments, the human was asked to direct the robot towards a particular left turn. Okay, so there's 3 left turns here. There's a long series of instructions, okay? And the lamp was asked to turn to a left turn and then show a particular colour by lifting up one of these tabs here that would be given an instruction. In one of the experimental conditions, both human and robot were learning the task at the same time together. Or was interpreting the simple voice commands and tracking the human hand and head movements as a means of following the human around, so that was how communication was occurring in that sense. Human participants would read OR's intentions and attitudes really from the way that it was moving its head and its neck, so the lamp stand and where it was pointing its beam and the colour that was shown. So as the lamp learns the task for itself, it begins to anticipate the human. The team moves faster and faster from one left turn to the next, and they begin to work fluently. So they're interpreting each other's small behaviours, and they get better at interpreting each other's small behaviours as they work. Strict turn-taking here is replaced by this kind of dynamic overlapping flow of movement. Occasional vocalisations, lamp colour changes, and it kind of moves together. OR is fixed in its overall position, but the dance of communication is here nonetheless. Now, the lamp was designed to look as much like a normal desk lamp as possible. There was a conscious effort to avoid anthropomorphism and zoomorphism here. But in fact, the comments of the participants who took part in the experiments showed that they did have anthropomorphic and zoomorphic responses. But even as they do this, Orr's difference from them, so that Orr is obviously a desk lamp as well, okay, it just seems to be an intelligent desk lamp, means that its form and its specific abilities remain in mind at all times, okay? And that's the same with the A-labs, it's the same with Fish and Bird. There's this idea of remembering that the robot's a machine that can do things that are different from the things that you can do. When the human participant makes a mistake, it becomes clear that this relation that has built between the human and robot has actually been enough to develop a sense of respect for Orr and a sense of trust in its abilities, okay? Because when the human makes a mistake, if the lamp has been learning the task as well, it will actually turn towards the way it thinks it should go, but then turn and look back at the human participant who's maybe directed it to the wrong place, and then there will be a sort of moment of rejigging where the human realizes that they were wrong, and the experiment will continue, okay? So the movement is very, very small, it's a small behavior. But it's noticeable, particularly because it interrupts the flow. So interruption is really key here. It interrupts the dynamic communication. The lamp shows an indecision, the human sees that indecision and pauses to correct their mistake. For this response to occur, the human must have developed a trust in the lamp, otherwise they would ignore that small motion. And that has led me to expand my research to consider robots like these. So, explosive ordnance disposal robots work in teams with humans. They don't do very much autonomously, though. They can right themselves and occasionally retrace their steps at the moment, although autonomy will be built into them. They're generally under the control of a human operator at all times. In spite of this, though, as recent news reports, the book of P.W. Singer has shown, etc., etc., they are thought of as team members. They're assigned names and genders. They are valued as brave and courageous. They're given medals, you know. They're recognised as individuals, in spite of the fact that there are many of this particular type, this packbot here, there are many of these actually deployed at the same time. Although radio-controlled, these robots reveal certain quirks. They misbehave. These quirks are not built in with programming. They don't emerge as part of a learned process. In fact, they're just a consequence of the physical environment in which the robot is operating. So maybe the robot will turn better in one direction than the other, for example, because it's a bit clogged up on one side. They're pretty simple problems that they often develop. But they're enough. Their small behaviours are enough to identify them as individuals, and people become attached to individual robots. They're random and unplanned. They're not precise transmissions of information. They can't be understood in terms of the cybernetic tradition. They are much more like small behaviours. The socio-cultural positioning of these robots is equally important because, of course, they're lifesavers. If something saves your life a couple of times, you become quite attached to it, even if it's a robot. So for many repair technicians, these robots are somewhat alive when they're operational. For a soldier, they're not replaceable. So a technician might suggest a replacement robot, but the soldier will want the original one back because he feels he knows how it works. Assuming that these robots become more autonomous then, I would argue that the relation that builds between operator and robot is actually increasingly important in developing the idea of respect and trust. So that as a robot like this that may have very different skills and abilities from a human, it can enter different spaces, it can see heat signatures, it can read chemical signatures, etc. So it has different information from the humans who are operating it. If you want the teams to work well, they have to build a sense of trust and respect so that the human will pay attention to the robot and the robot pays attention to the human. So I think that developments and research in social robotics are really important in a wide variety of spaces, even where you might not think of this as a social robot at all. It's the ideas and concepts behind social robotics are still important. Right, so I have just tried, at least, to consider robots from artistic practice, including Orr in that artistic practice, to emphasise ideas of encounters between humans and robots, the fluent dance of communication and the value of interruption to that dance. Communication here is very much more than language. It includes non-verbal communications as well as verbal. It includes small behaviours. As Donna Haraway has said, she's one of my favourite theorists, and I always like to finish with her, about human-animal relations, and much of this stuff actually gets drawn from human-animal research. Communication across irreducible difference is what matters. Respect is the name of the game.